Welcome, dear students. This session focuses on the stages in the development of a language. I hope and expect by the end of this session, you would be able to understand how a language takes birth and passes through different stages of its life. Well, my dear students, when we talk of change in a language, actually this change is always divergent. I would give you a simple example to help you understand what do I mean by this divergent development. Imagine one language spoken in two small adjacent villages, two villages that are nearby, same language spoken in both of the villages. Now, two things would happen. One, within each of the villages, village A and village B, the language would gradually change. Now, this would be a change across timeline. This would be a vertical change. This vertical change is in terms of, one generation is using it in a certain way, gradually and slowly through the times, passing on from one generation to the other, it would keep on changing. This change would be very slow. However, all this change happening in one village, village A, would be different from what is happening in village B. Now, let us imagine that there is a kind of a rivalry between the two, villages. They are enemies to each other. Of course, what would happen as a second kind of change would be they would like to be different because they're not friends, because they're enemies. They would not like to look like same in terms of language use. Naturally, they would take pride in those divergences. So what would happen? All right, the villages are nearby, adjacent to each other, but the language spoken would gradually become more and more different. There would be distance in the language. There would be divergence. Now what happens within the single village? Speech will remain fairly uniform as all the speakers are in constant contact. Now what would happen? Language within this village A and within this village B would, within each village, it would remain fairly common and uniform because all the people are in contact here and all the people are in contact here as well. But there is no contact or link between the two villages. This degree of difference between their ways of life, the rivalry they would have, enmity that they would have, the lifestyle that would be different, would affect how this language would go away from this language and how, there would be less and less contact. Gradually, it would become lesser through the times. The result would be, now, originally the language was one for village A and B, but now there are two dialects, dialect A and dialect B, that have one main source as language 1. Now suppose one of the people of one of these villages, they migrate, they have a migration, and they go off to a far off country, they travel away from here. The rate of divergence would also increase, and the longer influence that they would have on each other, would be kind of distanced, and they would not be any more linked to each other. What would happen? After a few hundred years, there would be two different languages. So, from one language to two dialects, but still they were closer because the villages were, adjacent. Now these people from one village have migrated. The distance has increased. The result is, after a slow process of, say, a few hundred years, two languages would emerge. When these two languages have evolved in this way from the earlier single language, we say that these languages are related. And when we trace the development of related languages from an earlier parent language, it can be diagrammatically represented through a tree diagram that you can see here. Here is the parent language, here would be daughter language A, and here would be daughter language B. As an example, I would say all the Romance languages, they have developed their own morphology, their own syntax, in fact, their own vocabulary, but they have, this common origin, Latin language. There are a lot of resemblances in these Romance languages, and the most of the resemblances that we find are in terms of vocabulary, though there is a lot of change in the pronunciation. For example, look at the Latin word for what we call good. The Latin word for that is bonus. Over the times, it has become Italian buono, Spanish bueno, French bon, Portuguese bom, Romanian ban. And all these varieties, you would have noticed there are certain familiarities and similarities that we can notice amongst them. In the same way, look at the Latin word for man. The Latin word is homo, and it has become, Italian uomo, Spanish hombre, French homme, Portuguese homen, and Romanian homme. I hope you would have an understanding of how, from one language, different dialects or different languages can take birth, and, in a divergent way, they can grow and develop and live their lives.